Hello, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with Steve Waters, who is the author of this phenomenal book about staff wellbeing. It's lots of case studies of schools that have embraced the need to engage with the new Ofsted criteria laid down in 2019 that you couldn't achieve a good or an outstanding for leadership in your school unless you clearly were establishing a culture of well-being in your school. So I'm going to ask Steve all sorts today. I'll be asking him about introducing himself and what he's been doing in schools, where this book comes from, and we'll talk about what school communities need to do to change things if they are concerned that their culture of staff well-being is not good, and what barriers schools are facing as well. Just brief introduction to the book. There's background research on the context for this. We have a lot of primary school case studies, a lot of secondary school case studies, and also some alternative provision studies and a conclusion. Okay, let's make a start. Steve, please can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your history and how it's led into this book?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Steve Waters, and I have a background in secondary education, taught English and drama, and then moved to a local authority and was a school improvement consultant. And throughout the years, and more recently in the last 5 years, I've been increasingly concerned about the mental health of teachers. The stress levels were always high in schools, and it's something that I experienced. But I think in the last 5 years, and also with the impact of COVID, the situation in schools, I think, has got far more desperate. There are more people on Twitter saying that they are considering leaving education, and a significant number of those are head teachers. And the statistics gathered by Education Support, the teachers' charity, bear out that there's never been a time greater than this when teachers are reconsidering whether they can actually carry on teaching and are concerned about their mental health. So we've got two extremes, one in early teacher training and in qualifying as a teacher. We find that 30% of teachers, around 30% of teachers are leaving before the first 5 years, and most of those are leaving within 3 years. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have teachers who are coming up to retirement age, but are still significantly short of it. So around 50 to 55 age group that are saying, I don't know how I'm going to carry on until retirement age. And many of them are leaving teaching to pursue other less stressful careers or setting up their own businesses. So this background gave me insight to the issues that we currently face in schools. And I was conscious that there were a lot of schools that were doing really excellent work in mental health and wellbeing for staff. So my niche is staff rather than pupils, and that's not because I don't care about pupils' mental health. I very much care, but my premise is that if you get the staff wellbeing and mental health right, they can teach more effectively, they have less stress in their lives, and also they're able to care for the pupils in the way that they would like to. And I was conscious that while there was research in this area, it's not that significant compared to a lot of research studies. And I was aware that there weren't very many case studies of schools who were already doing what I think most schools, all schools ought to do, and that is to take a whole school approach to staff wellbeing and mental health, so that they prioritize the staff and the staff are able to do their jobs. And I was really inspired by something that Richard Branson said. He said that good employers don't look after the clients, they look after their employees, and the employees look after the clients. And that's exactly the same in schools as far as I'm concerned.
And I noticed that message coming through firmly in some of these case studies. I should say the case studies are all written by key people at the schools,
Yes.
not by yourself. You've just been the facilitator of making this happen. And there are some phenomenal inspirational stories in here. And I love it that they're so forensic, so roots up. So people can take what they want from them, what they feel is appropriate to their school, and leave the bits that don't quite fit.
Yes.
It just really works.
Yeah, and that was the intention. So the chapters are written either by head teachers or by a wellbeing lead. Some of the wellbeing leads are not senior leaders. So it's not essential that someone is a senior leader to lead on mental health and well-being. However, it is essential that they have some training and certainly support to deliver their role. And some of the wellbeing leads in the book have done just that.
So how did you engage with the schools? How did you find them?
Well, I was very lucky. I simply went on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn and said that I was looking for schools to write chapters for the book. And although the book was intended to actually come out in 2020 at the latest, but because of the pandemic, the deadlines were put back. But even despite the pandemic, I got a really phenomenal response. I wasn't expecting to get anywhere near the number of schools that offered to write a chapter. And also, just by coincidence, there was a balance between primary, secondary, and then also 4 schools that are special schools or alternative provision schools. And then the representation also includes a free school, an international school, and a multi-academy chain. So the representation in the book, I was just so fortunate, the representation in the book is pretty much across the spectrum.
Okay, so my next question, which bits of which case studies really struck you? Which did you find most inspirational? I had a few and I may come back to them, but I'm interested to hear what was it that you, putting this together, went, yes, that's really...
Well, yeah, rather than pick out individual case studies, and as you said, you have your own personal favorites, I think it was the overarching theme that the schools in the book all had an aim of implementing a culture of, as the book title says, of staff well-being and mental health, not a disconnected series of initiatives or goodwill gestures towards the staff, although they are very nice to have. If you're only delivering, yoga on a Thursday and cakes on a Friday and doing nothing else, then unfortunately, while it's well-intentioned, it's going to be tokenism because you're not getting to the very roots, the very core. However, if I had to pick out a school that I think head teachers would be interested in perhaps considering the strategies in that school, it would be chapter 7, which is Jeremy Hannay's school, Three Bridges. And Three Bridges is a primary school in a deprived area of London in Southall. It's about 85%, I think, English as a second language. And it had, before Jeremy came, it wasn't in challenging circumstances, but it certainly wasn't achieving what Jeremy has achieved in that school. Jeremy Hannay is very outspoken. He comes from an area in Canada where there is no high stakes accountability for staff. And he kind of imported that vision for his school into Three Bridges and adapted it to the UK context. So Jeremy doesn't have any observation schedules, no learning walks, no book scrutinies, no performance management, no appraisal. And what he's done instead is he's handed over control for professional development to the staff. So instead of having hierarchical observations, he has asked staff to work in pairs or threes, and they identify successes that they want their pair or their partner or their partners to observe in their classroom. And they also identify challenges that they would like advice on. And the three or paired teachers work together. They don't report to him, they report to one another. And that gives you just a snapshot of how his school functions. He doesn't have mock SATs for the children. They are taught how to approach a SATs paper, but he just tells them it's like every other day in school. We're not going to get excited about it. We're not going to get concerned about it. Just do your best. So when Jeremy was expounding his philosophy really of well-being and mental health in his school, I know that some head teachers were very skeptical and said, well, you know, that's all very nice, Jeremy, to have a happy, clappy school, but what happens when Ofsted came? And what happens when Ofsted come? And he said, well, you know, let's see what happens. And he didn't really know what they would say. And they came in 2019, June 2019, and they gave the school outstanding in every category. And this underlines something that Jeremy repeatedly says. First of all, he's not very complimentary about Ofsted. He says that Ofsted is the root of all evil in the teaching profession. And he also says that head teachers are being fed a lie. And the lie is that the only way to raise standards is by implementing high stakes accountability measures. And of course, he doesn't do any of that, and his school's outstanding. So he's kind of living proof that if you put staff wellbeing at the center of your school and you remove constraints and controls and measurement and judgment, then staff flourish. And this is, interestingly, although the case study is a significant finding in terms of wellbeing and mental health in schools, as far as I know, the DFE is not celebrating that case study. And the reason I believe for that is because it doesn't fit their narrative. Their narrative is Jeremy's bête noire, that high stakes accountability delivers results. And this is unfortunate, because if more head teachers and more schools followed his example, perhaps teacher wellbeing would be in a better place.
Thanks for that. That was a really passionate insight into a key case study in this discussion. I'm going to challenge a couple of elements of it immediately, because I think it will make your book more accessible to a wider audience who can't consider going that far. The first I would say is, in assessing Ofsted, that is something that I've worked on over a great deal of time. And it's not the root of all evil. It does have that particular fault in driving high stakes accountability. It depends on the caliber of the inspectors you get. And the real problem with Ofsted that I've been working on for over a decade now is the lack of accountability to the profession and the public for the values in education that we know we all share. And there's specific reasons for that, but I won't go there today. I'm extremely critical of Ofsted, but that's the key problem. If you get bad inspectors who don't understand what you're doing, it's very difficult to get past that. And the other one is that there are lots of schools, and some of them are in this, who have not gone that far, not gone anywhere near as dramatically as he has, as you described just there, who clearly have phenomenal cultures of well-being. Quite a few of them have gone along the grounds of reducing marking. That seems to be something that comes as a theme when they discuss it as a school. They often decide we're going to do less more marking and more oral feedback. But that's probably the only one that's as radical as you've described. And I was in a school last week working there, I'm on supply just now, that had an excellent culture of staff wellbeing in the school. It was lovely, a real privilege to be part of. And I didn't see any of those things that you've just described in the school there. So, and when you were saying that it's not just about the token gestures, it's interesting in the case studies, I think, that in quite a few places, some token gestures were the obvious starting point for what was visible in the school. So things like lists of places to go if you need help with your mental health, and open strategy on that. Bits of the yoga, you know, as long as it's staff led and it is what staff are saying they want, it's a really good place to start, because it's difficult to make a start, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so yes, of course, and just on the last point, that if you make a small start and then you build on it, that's very different from a kind of checklist approach where, you know, to give you a really bad example or an unfortunate example, I was talking to a head teacher about well-being, and he said, "Oh, we've done that." So I said, "What, you know, what do you mean by we've done it?" "Oh, we had somebody from the NHS and they talked to the staff about stress for an hour in a CPD session." And he was honestly giving me that as an example of how that ticks the box. So we've done well-being, now we can move on. And I think, you know, that clearly is not going to be enough. And unfortunately, that also gives the negative impression to staff that you really are not too concerned about their well-being. You just want to kind of satisfy your governors that you've been doing something about it. So I think, yeah, you're right. And no school's gone as far as Jeremy. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be offering Jeremy as a case study example of good practice, because then schools can say, well, actually, we could implement lesson study by pairing staff and working in threes, but they might want to carry on doing some of the more accountable measures that are in place, and they might not have, you know, it takes a great deal of courage and a lack of concern about your own position to do what Jeremy has done. And for various reasons, not all head teachers are in his position. He's very well supported by his governing body, for example, whereas I know in some schools the governing bodies are less inclined to be creative and innovative and take a risk.
Would you say that the essence of this is having a head teacher who creates in their school an environment where decisions are imposed on staff? It is a genuine collective decision. All staff have been heard. If a staff doesn't quite agree with it, they understand why it's been made. And the head teacher is a personally wise person that they trust and respect. Is it as simple as that, the essence of cultures of well-being?
I think it has to start there. You know, I know a head teacher, for example, many people watching this will recognize the name, Vic Goddard of Passmore School. Quite a long time ago now, Vic Goddard School was the focus of one of the programs in the documentary series Educating in Essex. Vic Goddard is a very authentic head teacher, and by that I mean that he shares his own levels of stress and his own difficulties and challenges with the staff and asks for their help. So, for example, he will at a morning briefing, he might say, you know, I did far too much work over the weekend. I've exhausted myself, and I'm sure lots of you are in the same position. But if you see me around the school looking really stressed, you know, perhaps, and you have time, perhaps you wouldn't mind making me a cup of tea, and so that I can kind of continue. And he's very open to having a discussion with staff about how they can support him. So an NQT can support the head teacher just as the head teacher can support an NQT, and that has created, you know, loyalty to him, because he's a real person. He's not pretending to be something he isn't, and he understands that pressure and stress can affect him as much as any of the staff. What I would say is that there is, in the book, I explain that there's a key figure in what I consider to be organisational well-being that should be on everybody's lips in the education system, but no one really knows anything about her, and that's Christina Maslach. So Christina Maslach has been working on organisational well-being and mental health since the 1970s, and she's regarded as a world expert. So she's not predominantly working in schools or using schools as examples, but her workplace well-being approach is very relevant to education. So she identifies 6 factors that lead to poor mental health. The first is work overload, which teachers would identify with. The second is a lack of control. So people tell you what to do and then measure you, how well you've actually done it. Then there's a lack of reward, and this doesn't necessarily mean pay. It can mean being thanked for doing a good job, for example. A lack of community, so people work on their own. They are concerned about their individual health to the extent that they want to shut themselves away from the rest of the school because that's the only way to cope. So they close their classroom door, they have lunch in their own classrooms, and they don't socialise with the staff. Then the last 2 are lack of fairness. So there is a perceived inequity when job applications or jobs are announced. So you'll hear staff say things like, there's no point in me applying because I know who's going to get the job already, that kind of thing. And then finally, there's a conflict of values. So the values that teachers entered the profession in order to maintain, deliver, and espouse are not shared by the school. So, for example, a teacher goes into the profession because they want to care for children, but actually the job makes it impossible to care for children in the way that they would have liked to have done. And therefore, there's a mismatch between why they went into the profession, what they hope to achieve by being there, and what the school says its values are. And the more you have high stakes accountability and the less understanding you have of teachers' wellbeing and mental health, the more that happens, then the more that is a factor of one of the 6 in leading to burnout. So Christina Maslach has identified those 6 factors and said, unless you address them, you are creating conditions of burnout. And we know that there are teachers who fit into that description, who are on long-term sick, who have been signed off several times by the GP, who are absolutely exhausted and depressed, who physically can't actually go to work because they've gone beyond the point actually at which they can save themselves. And if you have burnout, it can take up to 18 months at least to recover from it, sometimes longer. So what I've attempted to do is to suggest in the book that all schools should be aware of these 6 factors and take action to avoid them.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important insight. It is in the book and I pondered on it a lot, and I've still got a long way to go thinking about it myself. So if we look at why schools have poor cultures of well-being, in my own head, I would say there are two reasons. One is either leadership or middle management that is being done by people who have bullying strategies for operating, who do prioritize the people who worship them and get rid of anyone that they consider to be a threat. And the other is that you've got leadership that's not like that, but is not coping. And there's so much coming at them that they feel they have to implement, and they don't know how to cope. And so they're passing it on, and it's taking a big toll, and they don't know how to cope with that either. And we are short of those amazing leaders, some of whom are described in these books. So if you were part of a community where either of those things were going on, if maybe you're a governor or maybe you're a member of staff who's concerned, where do you begin to address it?
Right. So if we take what I would call toxic schools, where bullying is rife and there's an attitude, if you can't cope, then get out, or when you come into school, leave your problems at the door. I'm not interested in hearing about them. Both of which I've heard said. Then you, as a teacher, you've only got three choices. One is to stay and cope with it. The other is to change it. And the third is to leave. So if you can't cope with it and you can't change it, you need to get out as fast as possible before it destroys you. Because however angry and unfair you feel, however angry you are and unfair you feel the situation is, if you can't change it and you can't cope with it, it's going to destroy you.
And I would inject in there, get your union on your side so you get a good deal and a good reference.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you need union support to ensure that you are not going to be unfairly treated by the school in moving on. The other is more complicated in how you deal with that. I think if middle leaders and senior leaders are really and head teachers are really struggling, then the ordinary member of staff, if I can call them that, or the member of staff without leadership responsibilities, I think it's really up to the staff to step back from making a judgment and say, how can we work together as a staff to support the leaders who are having such a difficult time? That is very difficult because, unfortunately, if it's accompanied by judgment and accountability, then the staff will feel, well, the people who are judging us are incompetent themselves. So, how does that work? And of course it doesn't. And I think possibly in some situations that's almost as difficult to cope with as a toxic school. I think the only way around it is, or the only way to deal with it, is to form perhaps a small informal group of staff and go to the leaders, not necessarily, not only criticizing, but also saying, we'd like to help, we'd like to, we know that you're trying to field lots of difficult things at the same time. How can we help? And how can we help each other to make the staff more of a community? Because Christina Maslach has said, as I've explained, that lack of community is one of 6 factors leading to burnout. So by default, you might be heading for burnout if the other 5 factors are also present.
I would like to suggest maybe that teachers in those situations could look around their community for very wise people who they trust and respect to bring in as governors, who can add capacity for mentoring the senior team and having input as well. It's been part of the government's green paper to have leads on children's mental health in every school. Now, if you've got a governor who's overseeing that, who also has a remit for staff mental health, that's a good starting point if it's someone, it's maybe a way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the government initiative to train a member of staff as a mental health lead, I think it's a great initiative. In fact, myself and my business partner, who's an ex-primary head, we've applied to be a provider of training for that mental health lead qualification, because we already have in place a training program, and we feel that we can make a contribution to improving staff wellbeing and mental health through that training program. Again, the mental health lead needs to be trained so that if they don't have experience of whole school change, which some mental health leads don't, that they can then be supported during the training to deliver that. Because as we've said, it's only by whole school change that a culture of staff wellbeing and mental health will be implemented and will become part of the school improvement plan, which it needs to be.
Yes, so I suppose that opens up the possibility of schools buying in the service of experts to mentor their leadership team as well. So the big question would be, how would a school contact you if they wanted to buy in your services, Steve?
Right, so just while we're talking about what we offer, so we also, that offering of training is going to be funded by the DFE if we're approved, but we also offer something we call the T12 Toolkit membership, which provides a set of services to school members, both as a whole school and as individual members. And if you want to know more about that, you can contact me at admin@t12toolkit.com. So admin@t12toolkit.com. And all our training and our intent and purpose is underpinned by everything I've said in that book. It's not, the book is not one of these books that says one thing and we do the other. It's the book underpins everything that we do, and what we do is the reason for the book.
Okay, good luck with all of that. Okay, so the big question, and this could be a day-long interview in its own right, so we're only going to be able to touch on some little aspects of it, but it's your chance to choose the ones that concern you. What are the barriers to progress with staff wellbeing that schools are facing as they try to work on this?
Wow, well, as you say, it could be a day's interview. There are so many. I mean, one of the key barriers is the external impact of the government line on how you raise standards. So it goes back to what I said about Jeremy's comment, that he feels that we've been sold a lie, that high stakes accountability is the only way that we can raise standards. And I know from the schools in the book, from Jeremy's school and from other schools, that if you introduce staff wellbeing and mental health, it impacts on pupils' mental health and wellbeing, and it also raises standards because people become far happier, and no one performs at their best if they're unhappy. It's as simple as that. However kind of wishy-washy that sounds, it's not actually. It's a truth about life. If we're unhappy, whatever it is, our relationships, our performance at work, if we're involved in sport, if we're unhappy, we don't perform well. It's as simple as that. So if you provide a good well-being and mental health structure in your school, then you are aiming for your staff and pupils to be happier. And a happy school, when you walk into a school, within a few minutes whether that's a happy school or not. I once talked to an HMI. This was in the days before Ofsted, because there were days before Ofsted, and he said, I thought it was nonsense, but he said, I can tell within 5 minutes of walking into a school, even just sitting in the reception, whether that school is a happy school and whether people enjoy working and learning there. And I just thought, no, that's nonsense. But then when I was working for a local authority and was visiting many schools, it actually is the case. It's frightening, but the whole atmosphere of a school permeates throughout to the admin staff behind the reception desk. And if they, if the school is not happy, then within a few more minutes of watching how people behave to one another and just their body language, you can tell that school is in a bad place. So the challenge then, the return to the question, the challenges are many. First of all, schools that are in challenging circumstances to begin with have a more difficult task, because to go against what the government are telling you creates improvement, if you're a challenging school, requires a lot of courage. It requires actually so much courage that head teachers, it's very difficult for head teachers to actually go down the line that, no, we don't need high stakes accountability, we're going to do it on our own. Because they're always thinking, well, as you said, Ofsted should be a system where, irrespective of the team that is going into your school, it should be making the same judgments. And it doesn't. We know, as you've said, that the inspection team itself is an issue.
I think I can put this clearly. The government system of education works okay in schools where the parents can support the children actively with their education, or
Yes.
they can bring in tutors where they know their child is struggling, or they can pull on extra resources to support their child, and they will.
Yes.
But when you get into those schools where very few parents in the community can do that, everything changes. And those teachers have to operate forensically. They simply cannot cope with the constant decisions from outside that aren't working in their classroom. And they need these head teachers who understand it and get it. And then you get Ofsted coming in, and they've only worked in the other type of school and the other type of environment, and they make judgments, and it's usually destructive. I know, I've been there.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, that the issue also is that the way that the government have compartmentalized schools mitigates against sharing good practice, because you're even within a multi-academy trust, it depends on the quality of the multi-academy trust and the strategies they've got in place for head teachers to share across their trust. So whereas in the long distant past now, schools were in local authorities, whatever, and I'm not saying that local authorities were the answer, that they had their own issues. However, what was the case was that head teachers in all of those schools in local authorities were invited to head teacher meetings and training where they shared strategies and good practice. And quite often it was the case that a school would have a visit from a head teacher or a senior leader or another teacher in another school to discuss what they were doing in their school that might work in the school they were visiting. And now there's emphasis on your results, your school, your children, your staff, and coupled with the fact that head teachers haven't got time to talk to one another. They're so busy fulfilling what the government want them to fulfill, or trying to do that there's no time for the important stuff of professional development.
And sometimes it's not allowed either. My first 6 years of teaching were in a community where all the head teachers worked together to provide for the whole community of children. And this was at secondary school. And whenever they made decisions about their schools, they considered the impact on neighbouring schools and didn't make those decisions that might push forward their own school's results if it was not going to support their shared ethical interest in providing for the whole community. We used to have a head teacher who explained this every morning in briefing, exactly what decisions were being made and why. And it went. And we changed teaching strategies, which were clearly going to get rid of a lot of children and exclude them from society and education. And the toll on teachers, and I was one of those who just couldn't live with that, changing my teaching strategies because I worked in the schools with most challenges. I was being asked to teach in ways that I knew wouldn't work and would be effectively bullying a lot of children, whereas previously we'd worked with teaching strategies that worked for them.
Yeah,
so that's
sure.
what my life is about now. It's about capturing and sharing those teaching strategies that are so close to extinction, and explain how they work, mainly up in Cumbria, where they kind of have survived in some schools up in the hills, mainly primary schools.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot there just in that conversation, following your question about challenges, that, you know, we could have another interview about, and probably a series of interviews about. I mean, I'm just wondering what might be interesting is, I've got the contact details of all the head teachers who submitted case studies. It might be interesting for you to ask one or two of them if they wouldn't mind being interviewed, because I think they've got a lot, you know, they've got so much to offer, and other head teachers who want to go down the same route, but perhaps need a bit more support to do it, particularly in challenging schools. I think it would be helpful.
Yes, that's certainly my channel now is about supporting people who have something to say it in public, and just
Yeah, sure.
have a voice. Yesterday, I had a really authentic live stream and discussion with lots of people on social media, lots of teachers who are struggling just now. So I wanted to conclude this interview with, for teachers who are struggling just now, it is an important part of life to struggle at times. Even if there were no policy issues that were affecting us, good teachers struggle because they become overwhelmed, and we can't always meet our own expectations. And especially when you have high expectations of yourself and many challenges, you will struggle at times. And it's important to go through that struggle with stress or anxiety, or however it comes out in you, as you take a journey to becoming a wise teacher who can inspire others. So get some sleep, take a few days off if you need to get things so you can stand back and look at things, ask for help, and understand that it may take a year or so of your life for you to get your head around what you're really grappling with and make real progress. But it's an important part of your journey. And don't be afraid to ask other staff for help.
Yeah, sure.
So you think you can't put extra work onto them, but somehow kind of it's not extra work. They just adjust and make different decisions. And sometimes it helps them to slow down a bit if they say, oh, I can't meet my expectations because my co-teacher is off sick, so I need to lower the bar a bit, and that could be quite helpful.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say before we tie off this interview today?
No, well, just one thought to pick up what you've just said, and that is that in toxic schools, you have the concept that taking care of mental health is an individual's problem. It's their self-care that does that, and the school doesn't have any part to play in mental health and well-being. In excellent schools, as in the schools in the book, you have a different attitude. You have the attitude that self-care is important, but so is the school, the organization, taking responsibility for creating the conditions in which people thrive and in which their mental health and their well-being is is embedded within the school's practices and its policies and strategies.
Yeah, and that's what I began with in my first year of teaching, when I shouted at another teacher in the yard I wasn't told off, even though I expected it and deserved it. I was told to tell them what was on my mind because they knew that that was a symptom that I wasn't okay.
Yeah,
They
sure.
kept at it until I told them that my mum had gone into hospital that morning and wasn't expected to come home again. And
Right.
then they sent me home. And that's exceptional practice when the leadership team know you better than you know yourself.
Yeah,
And
sure.
it's a huge, huge high bar to try and reach. And there's a lot of steps on the way to getting there in a school culture.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for your time, Steve. It's been
You're very
wonderful.
welcome.
Hugely appreciate it.
No problem.
Good luck with
Thank you.
everything you try to do in the future. Goodbye for now.
Okay, bye. Bye.